Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about Nomen and its use for appellations in RDA. Nomen is a very strange thing, as I keep saying, so I hope I can expose some of the weirdness of it. First of all, it's unlike any other entity in the library reference model and in RDA. We can say an RDA entity, any entity, has appellation, and then the value of that element has appellation is always a string. And if it's an appellation, we call it a Nomen string. The reason why it's called Nomen, by the way, is the LRM didn't want to confuse people by calling it name, because this applies to titles of works, etc., and generally labels. So they used the old trick from Fresad of using Latin to try and make sure nobody misunderstood. So when we say RDA entity has appellation Nomen string, what we're saying is all things have names. And the Nomen string is that name. It's always a string. But Nomen itself is what's called a reification of the statement. In linked data terms, we take the whole statement, RDA has appellation Nomen string, and we turn it into a thing. And then we can say things about the thing. And the thing is called a Nomen. So the Nomen is actually, in the LRM, the entire statement, RDA entity has appellation Nomen string. And therein lies its weirdness. So it's a reification of this entity has this name. In RDA, we tried to make this a little bit easier to digest. So we've used the entity Nomen in a more conventional way. And the model is RDA entity has appellation Nomen, and then the Nomen has a Nomen string, the Nomen string. So this is just an expansion, in fact, of the previous slide, the reification. The important thing to note is that the Nomen is characterized or distinguished by two things and not just one. It depends on what RDA entity is being used, and it depends also on the Nomen string. If we have two entities, instances of an entity, which have Nomen strings that are the same, my string, we are in fact dealing with two separate Nomens. The Nomen is not the Nomen string. And so two Nomen strings that are the same are treated as two separate Nomens. What this means is if we have two data statements, RDA entity, one has appellation Nomen, one has Nomen string my string, the second entity has appellation Nomen 2 has Nomen string my string. We can infer that if the two entities, the RDA entities in those two statements are not equal, then the two Nomens are not equal also, despite the fact that they have identical Nomen strings. I told you it was weird. So the utility of Nomen is that you can make statements about the Nomen and therefore about the Nomen string. Who assigned the name? My birth name was assigned by my parents. Other people assign me other names, some of which I don't hear. The government assigns me another name. What is the script? The This can be useful in systems that require transliteration, etc. What other names is this particular name related to? We're actually having a discussion right now in modeling Nomen as a namespace as to whether nomens can have parts. And we're discussing the issue of double-barreled surnames, which is one nomen that's, or nomen string, that is derived from two separate nomens by a specific act of marriage, usually. So the main utility of using Nomen and its string is name authority control. So we can say a nomen has nomen string, nomen string. We can use the inverse property and say that this nomen is an appellation of this RDA entity. We can say that that nomen was assigned by this agent. The nomen has a certain date of usage. I've had many nicknames in my life, some pleasant, some unpleasant, and generally they're confined to certain situations, particularly at school. So the date of usage of some of my nicknames is confined to my school years. The date of usage of many women is confined to their single status. When they get married, they change their nomen. And as I said, we're currently discussing the modeling of nomens having parts. All of these elements have been added to RDA, so they're all available for name authority control. And this is just a sample. There are others. Such as one nomen is derived from another nomen, etc. The LRM itself doesn't say much further about nomen, but in RDA, we've been able to use this strange thing and categorize it into the kinds of nomen strings that are used in bibliographic description and access. So the first category is the common name or title, the one that's found on resources, the one that's in common use. For me, it's Gordon Dunsire, sometimes G. Dunsire. And we have made an element subtype of nomen, which is name of RDA entity, and then further broken that down into preferred name and variant name. Using legacy practice to determine these categories. The next category is a browse name, typically found in browse indexes, and this is more structured. You will not find Dunsire, Gordon anywhere outside of a browse index. It's simply not normally used. And we can categorize those as access points, and again split that into authorized access point and variant access point. And the final category of nomen used in RDA is the identifier, and it has only the one element identifier itself. An identifier could be a social security number, and for a serial it could be an ISSN, for a manifestation it could be an ISBN, etc. We don't generally treat an IRI for linked data as a nomen. The LRM says this is perfectly permissible, but in fact it's redundant because an IRI is what I'm calling self-reified. It names itself, it is the thing in the thing. If we were to treat the IRI as a nomen and the HTTP bit as the nomen string, then we would sign an IRI to it, and that doesn't make sense. We have IRIs of IRIs, and then we could sign an IRI to that IRI and go into an infinite loop. So we've avoided that completely by not treating the IRI as a Nomen. The reason for the categorization is because of the recording methods, and as you know, the recording methods are an RDA artifact. They have nothing to do with the library reference model. So any RDA entity can have a name, which is the common name, the category. It can have an access point, which is its browse name. And it can have an identifier. So the same entity can be labeled, named in 3 different ways. And this is what we actually find in practice. And these methods of labeling and the resultant Nomen strings, we're now calling and tying up with the idea of an unstructured description. That's the common name. A structured description, that's the browse name, because we've added structure to it, often normalized it, inverted it. And the identifier is just an identifier. So as well as being able to categorize and record in a consistent and regular manner the names of things in themselves, we can also use this device when we talk about related entities. So when one RDA entity is related to another RDA entity, we can shortcut through the related entity and just refer to it by one of its names. This is a very powerful device because it means you don't have to reify the related entity. You don't have to create a separate set of metadata for it. You don't have to supply an IRI for it. You can go straight from the RDA entity being described to the related entity and refer to that related entity by one of its names. As I said, it's extremely powerful and is one of the basic features of RDA. So finally, I just want to talk about the relationship of Nomen and other ontologies. This weird beast isn't something confined to the LRM and RDA. In particular, there is an ontology called SCOS-XL, and it is the extension for labels, that's the XL bit, of SCOS, Simple Knowledge Organization System. We use SCOS in the RDA linked data elements to describe the things that we're talking about, the labels, etc. And SCOS-XL is very old now in linked data terms. It's been around for, I think, 10 years. And the basic structure and utility is that a label can have a literal form. And I called this literal form Nomen string because this is exactly the same thing as saying Nomen has Nomen string, Nomen string. So in fact, the treatment of Nomen is very similar to the treatment of labels within SCOS-XL. BibFrame takes a rather different approach. In BibFrame, classes, that's entities, have been declared for a whole bunch of what we're treating just as nomens. So identifier is a class in BibFrame, title is a class in BibFrame, variant title, key title, abbreviated title, and so on and so on. There isn't enough room on the screen to list them all. There are something like 30 identifiers, and I assume that if a new international naming system comes along, then it will be treated as a class and another class will be added to BibFrame. The curious thing in BibFrame is that there is no name entity. These are all titles or identifiers, but there's nothing about names there. So it's a strange thing. So in conclusion, Nomen is essential for name authority control. You have to be able to say things about the name and reify. But outside of authority control, generally speaking, we're only ever going to use Nomen strings using the shortcut that I showed. So we don't have to get too entangled with description, with the weirdness of Nomen. We can just treat the Nomen string as we've always treated it. The Nomen model is similar to SCOS-XL, but there may be issues in the future in interoperating with BibFrame because of this omission of name. And that's me.
We have time for questions and comments for Gordon. As I mentioned, please, if you have some, please either go to the mic that Kate will option off or to the audience mic.
Regina Reynolds, Library of Congress. So, Gordon, are there discussions, negotiations with the BibFrame developers about this potential interoperability? I think, yes. Oh, this is Regina Reynolds.
I'm not sure it's on.
And you have to turn it on.
And it's the on and off switch is down in the bottom. It's in the bottom part of the microphone. The microphone itself, on this bottom part, there's a little switch right next to the base here.
Okay, I'll repeat the question and I'll answer it. So, Regina Reynolds from the Library of Congress has asked whether there's been any dialogue with the BibFrame developers about this, what I think is a curious omission. The short answer is no. There's been no dialogue with the BibFrame developers, period. I only noticed this omission, in fact, when I was putting the presentation together. But I hope perhaps the presentation will maybe start somebody thinking about it.
Kelly? Kate's getting her work out here.
Kelly McGrath, University of Oregon. Could you give a concrete example of the shortcut, like not just an abstract one, but a concrete example of when you would use that?
Sure. If I write the book, then you want to relate the book to its author, and the author is a person. I'm a person. So you could say work has author, person, and then the person has Nomen, Gordon, Dunsire. But you can also, as we currently do, you can just say work has author, person, string, Gordon, Dunsire. This is its powerful utility. You don't have to then reify me. You don't have to create a separate record for me in order to do that. Everything's encapsulated within the description of the work itself.
That's from the British Library. Can I ask, in terms of a metadata work, so a bibliographic or authority record, can it be said that they can also have Nomen, and that an example of that would be, for example, a record control number?
Well, the answer to the first part is yes, because anything can have a name, including a statement. So what you're really saying is that if I make a statement such as this person has name of person, Gordon Dunsire, and then you can label the entire statement with a name. I'm struggling to think about why you would want to do that.
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of a type of nomen is an identifier.
Ah, I know what you're talking about.
Okay.
I got it. So if you have, I'll talk in linked data terms, if you have a metadata description set, that's a number of statements about one thing, usually referred to as a record, then you want to identify the entire set of statements in one go. And so that graph of the set of statements can be reified. And this is a common phenomenon in linked data processing, that you reify such statements. And a record control number is an identifier, therefore it's a nomen. So yes, you can.
Thanks very much.
Oh, it's not on. I know how to turn this on. It's the smallest button.
Thank you. In your example, it sounded like you were saying that Gordon Dunsire wouldn't have to be like an established name for a known entity. Could just be a name that I come across in cataloging, for instance. So it's not reified in the sense of being an established RDA entity. Does it have to be reifiable as an RDA entity? Or could any entity have a nomen in the sense that you were describing?
Any entity can have that kind of nomen string. I have an unusual name. There aren't many other Gordon Dunsires. They do exist. There are one or two around. If my name was John Smith, you can see where we're going with this, and this is why it's important for name authority control. So if you use the shortcut method and say, this work has author person John Smith, then that's really quite inadequate for most applications. You would have to then say something about which John Smith, and reify it. Therefore, you turn the name into a nomen. Of course, what we actually do in practice and through tradition is we disambiguate the name by creating yet another nomen string. So we'll add dates and field of activity and all those other qualifiers to disambiguate the name. Each time we do that, we create a new nomen string, and therefore we create a new nomen. So typically, for people with very common names, Jane Doe, etc., there's likely to be a lot of different nomen strings in use for that particular entity, depending on how the name authority file chooses to disambiguate the name. There's more than one way of disambiguating a name. And we call that an authorized access point, but it's a different nomen.
Anyone else? This is your chance to try to stump Gordon.
So do nomens like potentially, I mean, I guess they do, but you know, to other parts of the bibliographic record, like so if you're talking about extent and you had the, you know, the way that you're measuring it, like pages, kind of like there was some CCDA task force that had to make that more machine actionable. Then you could have, you know, pages and the English label and the Spanish label and so forth, and sort of, you know, make that into more atomic parts using nomens.
You could, but there are better ways of doing that. You don't have to reify something to use a translation, and a translation is also a different nomen string again. So in those circumstances, I think it's better to use a translation. And in any case, the nomen must be connected to an RDA entity. The example you're giving, the entity is an extent measurement. It's not the thing that you're measuring, it's the statement you're making about its extent. And so that's not an RDA entity, and therefore that method of of assigning nomens is out of scope for RDA. If we could do that, we would all go crazy. But you can, and this is a philosophical point, you can label a person by, you know, the person sitting over there in the corner. And that's a label, and it's a name. It does actually identify the person. So that probably could be treated, that descriptive phrase probably could be treated as a nomen for that person. But that can be stretched too far, I think. And certainly there have been suggestions that the entire description of a person just becomes a nomen, in which case all we're ever dealing with are nomens and not anything else. There's no real utility in that either. So I think nomens are best confined to what I've shown, those three categories, the utility that comes with it, and to names and titles of RDA entities.
And just to touch on the other point that Kelly brought up about the CCTA task force that produced the analysis of how to better atomize the extent, this is something that the RC will be taking up in the post 3R period. So that the work is not died, it's just way too complicated to have incorporated into the 3R project itself. Anyone else? Last call? Kate stands ready to run a mic over to you. All right, well, if not, thank you very much, Gordon.
Thank you.